Welcome to this webinar on the future of identity. It's a really exciting topic, and I'm really happy to have two distinguished guests here. Before I introduce them, just some practical info. This is being recorded, so it can be watched later. And if you do have any questions, please use the question box in the app. We also plan to do some polls during the webinar, and you will see them popping up on your screen, so that should be fairly simple to do. So thank you everybody for joining, and I'd like to introduce my two guests here. First, Jon Sharma, chairman of the EEMA, and he's received the EEMA Fellowship Award for services to e-identity. He has a long background in EID and trust. And interestingly, he has an academic background in aeronautics and astronautics. So we're going to fly high here, right, John?
Absolutely, absolutely. Surprising related.
Yeah, really great to have you here, John. Then we have Hussein from Onfido. He's the CEO and the co-founder. He's recognized by the World Economic Forum as a tech pioneer. He's a contributor to Forbes, and he's also been recognized as the Forbes 30 under 30. So good to have you here, Hussein.
It's great to be on.
We are going to talk about my favorite topic, digital identity. And of course, in the future, we want to have one, I like to call it a digital twin, sort of my digital counterpart in cyberspace, or a double if you like. And I'm going to use this for everything, like one way of identifying myself. And I use that for everything, for onboarding, for authentication, attribute verification, and electronic signatures. In the Nordics, we have actually gotten pretty far on this. I mean, we have 90% coverage of the bank IDs, and on average, people use them 4 times per week. And we see things happening in the Benelux area. But of course, this is not the one. I can use this for a lot of purposes. I can use it for my bank, my insurance, government, for taxes, etc. So there's a lot of use cases, but still there are a lot of use cases where I can't use it. And the challenge with a Nordic model is the high dependency on social trust. So, I mean, we realize this model is not transferable necessarily to other countries. And also, there's not a lot of information available. It's the name, it's a date of birth, your national identification number, some few attributes, and I think we really need to have some more. I see two important challenges. One, how do we bind this digital twin, this digital double, to real identity? I mean, I'm a real person, I need to bind to that one. And secondly, how do we know that it's actually the physical person, that I'm actually using it, that I'm actually present? And this is interesting. There's going to be a change in Norwegian finance law now, that you need to prove when signing a contract that the user is actually present. So the EID proves the identity, but the EID itself doesn't prove that that person is actually using it. So that's an interesting challenge. So, I mean, that's some of my view on some of my challenges. So what will digital identity look like in the future? And one question, I mean, is who you are, sorry, what you are or what you're allowed to do more important than who you are? So John, you want to start off on that?
Yeah, I have a worry. To start off negatively is never good, but there you go. I have a worry that we're starting to see now a situation where the issues that we're discussing are becoming more and more urgent. And that means that when we're talking about 2030, I think maybe it might be too late down the line for some fundamentals. But to ask what is 2030 going to look like, I have a vision in my mind which is perhaps very, very similar to John Eric's, a digital twin, or some people call it a digital butler, that deals with the issues that you have, that you use every day, that knows the context that you're using your identity, because that's a critical thing. is which should get round the personas that you need to project, because you don't have one identity. You are one person, but your identity is actually contextual. And I know people talk about this all the time about, well, we need to make sure that the identity is contextual. For it to be convenient and for the friction to be reduced, that context has to be self-evident. I don't quite know how we would do that. I would imagine in the enrollment, you build up the contexts so that they're easily identifiable. So like a shortcuts. And I think that's critical. Also, along with the liabilities and the issues, and contexts may have different levels of assurance or different strengths for the identities as well. And I think it should be driven by the context. I think that
I agree. I mean, the context is really important because you want to share different information with different people. I like your I like the butler concept. That was sort of interesting. The butler acts on your behavior.
Yeah, it's nice that from a science fiction story.
Yeah. I think that's good. So my first challenge, Hussein, was, how do you bind a real person to this? Let's call him the butler. I think that's a good term. Sort of, how do you bootstrap this from a people perspective, and when?
So you have your physical offline identity, your carbon copy, and then you have a digital world where you need to, as you're saying, anchor the physical identity into a digital identity. And what's that bridge or that binding or the connection or the anchor, as you say it could be. There are different ways that that are the key to access. So one key to access historically has been face-to-face. I go into the bank branch and they see me visually. That doesn't scale and it's not convenient. Second, you have the credit bureau model. The bank that sees me face-to-face logs my date of birth, name, and address into a centralized database that everyone else has access, and then therefore what I claim is my identity. I know my date of birth, name, and address, and that in some ways is supposed to bind me and connect me. The challenge there is, because of the leaks, it's very easy for impersonators to buy your date of birth, name, and address on the dark web. There are increasingly other tools, knowledge-based questions and things like that, but they have a security problem given the data breaches, and B, an access problem because half the world's adult population is not on a credit bureau. So our approach is using a government identity like a driving license or passports and facial biometrics, so that you use the person's ID, we verify it's genuine and it's not a fake, and then we take the person's face and we bind it to that ID, and that's how we connect it to the digital world. The point becomes, in the future, around a digital identity, once you've anchored a physical offline identity into a digital one on the Monday, then on the Wednesday, Friday, and every sort of day thereafter, the hope is that you wouldn't have to go through this whole process again. So with the great work that Signicat does, and essentially the approach of using other tools that become more authentication based. So the Wednesday digital identity is the same one as the Monday one. That is a bit that makes it even easier to use.
Exactly. I mean, that must be the whole point. You should only need to have to do that proof once, right? And then it should be really simple to reuse it and for different purposes. You think, I mean, we're talking 20, 30, 10 years in the future. I mean, going 10 years back, a lot has happened. Will we get to the point where when you get your birth certificate, you will also get your digital butler?
Probably not, in that the intention is, it kind of becomes a point, not just at the point of registration, but on an ongoing basis. How do you prove what's the core components of your offline connecting to your online identity and preventing anyone else pretending to be you? So biometrics becomes important in that. So whether it's facial recognition, which is our focus, or other means. The problem with as you're born, the facial biometrics that you have, every time thereafter, that might change, and sort of, so it becomes a bit hard to see. There's also a privacy consideration and potential misuse and so on. Identity is a pretty sensitive and important topic, rightfully so. And in all likelihood, we're going to get to a point where in the future, different organizations can become identity providers, issuing credentials and essentially confirming a person's identity. but that ultimately is a consumer-driven identity approach. So where I, as a user, I own and control the identity, and I'm not dependent on any government or any tech company or anyone else in order to help me prove that I am who I claim to be.
Right. You mentioned the P word a couple of times, the password. I mean, the dreaded identification. That's, I mean, it's a nightmare, right? With all the password and the breaches. There were recently a breach in the Norwegian government now with the email and so on. And you also mentioned biometrics. I mean, how will we prove presence in the future? Is it going to be biometrics? Well, what's the take on that? And while you answer that, let's bring up the poll on that and see what the audience thinks about the same thing. So, John, you want to chip in on passwords or identification?
Yeah, I hate passwords. Generally, I wish they weren't around, like most people, but I think they have come to be an issue now that they need to be dealt with. Biometrics and behavioral biometrics, as long as there's very little friction, then I think they could be usable, because people are going to get sick and just not use them. Or a password, truthfully, passwords have got very much weaker recently because perversely, because they are longer and more complicated, people are just using one and they're reusing it over and over again. And that's the problem.
It's a problem for breaches as well. I mean, you breach one place, you breach it everywhere.
I challenge somebody to remember all the different passwords they've got.
No, we can do that.
So there has to be something else. I thought a lot, just what you were just saying just now, and I've thought that the idea of getting an ID at birth is okay, but I think more so what you need to do is to have a periodic refresh of your identity.
Right. Yeah.
So let's say every 5 years, say you refresh your photograph, you refresh your everything else, and if you're using a trust anchor that's consistent, like a government ID, however basic it is, but it will be a trust anchor. It will be something. An anchor, but then you just refresh the details.
Exactly.
And lots of algorithms around that can be.
I think that's important. We need to do that. We think of this as a one-time, but we need to do it periodically. We mentioned biometric, Hussein. I mean, I have this idea that my phone and my smartwatch and stuff, they will know they're in my possession. You think we're gonna get there in 2030, that I don't really need to worry because my devices know who I am?
It's hard for it. So first of all, I definitely think passwords are going to go away. We have more than 100 on average, and there's many security flaws. And a third of the time that we sort of try to log in, typically we forget ours and we have to try a few times. Therefore, we have to think a bit more about what the long term is going to look like. I'm very convinced it's going to have a significant component of biometrics in there. And it's just a happy coincidence that the audience seem to sort of, at least 2/3 seem to see biometrics being a key part. Device is likely to play a key role in it. We have to remember, if you sort of lose a device, how do you regain that connection to ensure the device actually belongs to you, not an impersonator? But what's most important is that it's going to be super frictionless. And if there are different conditions that have to be met for what the future looks like, one is has to grab inclusion. So as many people in the world as possible are able to be included for the access. That's to stop bad actors and fraudsters. It has to be super convenient and ideally frictionless or touchless or even invisible as far as the sort of user behavior goes. And lastly, it has to respect privacy. And on this convenience point, it's going to be perhaps like your Uber, whereby you order a car and it takes you from A to B, and the payment is taken care of. Now there's a log and you can go and view how the payment was taken and what card it was taken and so on, but you don't need to worry about the payment. It's just taken care of. And in a similar way, in the future, as you walk through a train station or check into an airport or make an online payment or even sign up to an online bank account, your ability to prove that you are who you claim to be and gain digital access will be completely smooth and frictionless, and you don't need to essentially worry about it. It's all taken care of while stopping the bad actors, while giving access to everyone, and the other three conditions that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's important what you mentioned about, it needs to be available for everybody and usable for everybody. I mean, if you look at the poll results, I mean, people have, majority have belief in the biometrics, of course, because I guess many of us are used to it. We're using this on your mobile device, which is, can be argued, is that really a biometric to prove who you are, or is just an alternative to unlocking your device? So it's an interesting question. There are some people that believe in the behavioral. I personally, I'm in a belief that, that's going to happen. Still, some people that want to cling on to passwords or PIN, or don't believe that we'll be able to get rid of them. So interesting. And there's some others as well that, maybe there are some other ideas. So yeah, can we just close the poll then?
So now, just something on that poll, which is interesting, is that if you look at the top value, which was 65%, and it was the buffer biometrics, and that was face, fingerprint, and I can't remember what the other ones, but I think two of them are face and fingerprint, right? The two big ones. Both of those are unusable at the moment, which you've got to go face. Have you tried opening up your iPhone with facial recognition if you've got a mask on?
Yeah, I tried yesterday. It didn't work.
So you can't do anything, or with any mask over, it probably won't work. Fingerprints, you don't want to touch a contact, have any contact with your finger. So you have to, I don't know if there's been I'm not that much into the advanced processes or concepts in biometrics, but have they, I'm not sure whether the concept of step up and step down authentication for biometrics, if you can't use one biometric, you go to another one, let's say eye or whatever, you're going from retina to fingerprint, and then you step up again as soon as that's possible. So
well, currently, I mean, it's just defaulting to your PIN code. So, I mean, your phone is not more secure than your PIN code. And again, the biometrics is just there to unlock the device, not really to prove who you are. So that's an interesting difference.
There is an issue with regards to that. There might be a default level of assurance with regards to the identification that could be built in, or a backup one, when you are onboarding. So that if one doesn't work, the other one can, because you just don't know what's going to be available or not at any particular time.
Yeah, I completely agree. One important thing you touched on, Hussein, was in inclusiveness, that it should work for everybody. I mean, there's been some bias in the data of biometric recognition. I guess I'm in the prime group, an old man from the Nordics. I mean, I'm going to be recognized on face, but not, I mean, if you have different skin colors and so on, they're not as good. Any comments on that, how that is dealt with, Hussein?
It's pretty important. We all know that identity inclusion is a precursor to financial inclusion. And in most economies, the United Nations estimates that, especially in emerging economies, a 1% increase in identity and financial inclusion is a 3.6% increase in GDP. So it's a very fundamental infrastructure component of society. And so when people are excluded, it's actually pretty much a big deal. And as for the challenges, having a bank, that face-to-face option as your way of proving yourself, well, we know that a lot of the world doesn't have a bank in close to their proximity. Even in the developed market, like in the US, the largest economy in the world, it's very well documented that especially Black and Latino communities typically don't have banks there. So that is key, and that helps the digital transformation. And secondly, credit bureaus, again, we mentioned about how half the world's adult population just aren't on a credit bureau, and therefore there's no way to get extended time to them. So the way that the extension of the smartphone helps, or in essentially a camera-enabled device and a government-issued identity, should be sufficient to help everyone be able to prove their identity. And the ceiling on that currently We still have 1.1 billion people in the world without any sort of government-issued identity, but there's a United Nations program 16.9 to get us there, hopefully at the very least by the end of this decade. And with the progress made in India with the Aadhaar card and so on, we're on a good trajectory. And of sort of the 2 billion people in the world who are typically financially underbanked and unbanked, half of them have a camera-enabled device. So physical identity card and a camera-enabled device with internet connectivity should be sufficient for you to be able to gain access in a secure and convenient way.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and you know, it's really sad with so many people not being able to prove who they are, and it's good to see these initiatives from UN and the World Bank to address those issues. One question that we also briefly touched on, I mean, we see these identities typically being, you register with somebody and there's somebody taking, you know, managing this. You have the bank IDs in Norway, etc. And then you have sort of on the completely other side, this self-sovereign movement where, you know, everybody's going to be their own, take care of their own identity. Are end users capable or willing to do this, or do we need some custodians of handling this, John?
Yeah, I'm one of these people that don't believe the vast majority of people want to look after their own identities. Identity is something that they need. They just want. It's an additional layer of complication for them if you have to say, well, how you've got to not only prove who you are, you've got to prove all the little bits of you as well, all the time, and manage them. And I don't think this management will be good for the vast majority of people. As self-sovereign identity is good for some, but in reality, where their lives are maybe very complex and get entangled. But for the majority of people, you go into the street, honestly, and you say, do you want to manage your own identity all the time or whatever? They'll say, no. So you immediately have to offer some sort of management system for your identity anyway, and then you start getting into additional problems and additional security problems and all sorts of things. I'm not sure whether, although we call it a distributed identity, it's actually the opposite, because you're putting all the various aspects of your own, of the individual's identity, for want of a better word, for the all their attributes, under the control of the individual, which is almost a single point of failure. So you're actually shifting a set of problems from one to the other. I'd far more prefer to say, I want to onboard with a particular application provider and then let them deal with all the issues for me and all the context and extend it that way, having to do everything myself. I'd be petrified. I forget things. A lot of people.
I mean, and that's important. I mean, one aspect that's rarely covered in those discussions is account recovery. As you say, you forget stuff, and we're used to having our back covered. I mean, if I lose my car key, I can always call somebody. If I lose my house key or if I lose a password, there's always somebody to cover my back. But if I'm handed this myself, we sort of give away that possibility. And I guess I'm not the only one that's lost data because I hadn't created a backup scheme for my PGP private key, right? And I should know better. And Hussein, any thoughts on this?
Do people want to control their identity? No, probably not. I don't think most don't care and don't know about it, nor is it realistic to expect them to. But what people actually want is to access services with the least friction possible. Now, just the way, a few decades ago, cash was the common thing, no one cares too much about credit cards. What they care about is buying something. But a credit card is a tap, whereas a cash, you have to get it out and count. When you give them the option, cash, and it takes you 20 seconds of counting and it's kind of difficult, versus a credit card and it's just a tap. When you put it in front of them and you make it an A-B choice, they default always to the most convenient, most secure, least costly option. So this will not be a consumer-driven change. This will in all likelihood be a business and organizational-driven change, where organizations at some point are going to offer the option for you to go down the slow path of showing your ID, your face, or your credit, or your credit bureau data, or your knowledge-based question, and so on. Or you can go down the fast path, which is a portable identity and a username password approach. So one that when users are given such a super simple choice of something difficult versus a happy, easier path, they'll default to the easy path. And as more and more consumers default to that easy path, before long they will all realize that they actually have created an account that has their identity, and that will become the default thing. But it's not going to be a consumer-driven one. It's predominantly going to be a business-driven one, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, you touched on, and I mean, we are identity nerds, right? And we think identity is the most exciting and the most important thing in the world. But as you mentioned, Hussein, for people in general, this is just, you know, something that's between them and where they want to go to, and we need to remember that. And it's a very good example, you know, when you offer them distinct choices.
That's why
it would be interesting
that's why checks don't work. That's why checks aren't
worse. Exactly.
Yeah, I've heard about checks. We had them in the medieval times in the Nordics as well.
All I think of when I get a check, whether it's for £5 or 5,000 euros or $100,000, is bloody hell, I've got to go to the bank and give it to somebody and spend half a day messing around getting the check into my bank account and then waiting. That is not what I want.
No,
that's what I want.
So why do you use them at all then? So that, you know, just to continue here, let's put on the next poll. I want to ask the audience. I mean, if I'm not going to do this myself, who would I want to be my custodian of my identity? Who would I want to handle this on my behalf? So if take some minutes to fill in that one. And I mean, there are different. I guess different people would choose different providers of this, and I think that's the goal we want to get to as well, right? Where it should be possible to choose and also transport from one to another. Hussein, any comments on, you know, who the providers of identity?
So the custodian of your physical identity, or at least the authority that we all collectively trust to issue us with our physical identity, is the government. The custodian of a digital identity is very tricky, because a digital identity, given how important it is everything. So if you lose your digital identity, a fraudster, impersonator, anyone, we all have either ourselves or a friend, cousin, family member who's been the victim of identity theft, and it really can make such a significant impact to your life because it's so important. And that's ignoring the fact of the Big Brother society and sort of the surveillance society and all the other issues and risks that come with it. So given that it's hard to see a world where we can trust big governments with something so important, and we can trust big tech, given that there's abuses that have already happened on a daily basis, whether it's Facebook or Amazon or others, it kind of, by extension, it defaults, in my view, to the custodian having to be the individual. Now, that's in contradiction to the last question, because I just said customers don't care, or individuals, mostly on balance, don't care or want to know about identity. And yet now I'm suggesting that they're the only options to be the custodian. You can fix the two by giving them an incredibly easy user experience where they don't have to think about it too much. They just have 1 or 2 clicks and they're good to go. In essence, you don't need to, if you have a PayPal account that you pay every time quite easily, with just a username and password, you don't need to know the mechanics or the technology behind it. You just create an account, and every time you just use it. You don't need to understand how the rails works or anything else. I think if it were to be, if identity is simplified to the same extent as payments are, we will have a one-click, one-touch digital access approach with identity, at least in the next few years.
Right.
Yeah. Hussein, you're right, and drawing the parallel to payments is quite interesting, because part of the friction, removing friction in managing your identity, is the fear, removing the fear of doing something wrong and then getting the whole thing into a big mess. So right. Just like with credit cards or PayPal, I want to pay something, I just use it. It's just simple, and if there's a mistake, I know that I'm safe. That if there's a mistake or somebody screws me on the payment or the credit card payment goes wrong or whatever it is, I call up the credit card provider. It's gone wrong, sort it please. Yes, your money's back in your account, no problem. How that works out in a identity point of view is a bit more difficult, but that removing the fear of flying, so to speak, is exactly
it's a very good point. Let's see what the audience answered on this one, you know, who they would want to have as the custodian. And yeah,
interesting. Big tech, yet it's the big techs that are driving identity as a whole as an initiative, but it's really telling. I think it's a very interesting answer here.
Yeah, nobody wants the big techs. And
also interesting because people, it seems like we've got more of the identity enthusiast end of the spectrum on listening in today.
You might be blacklisted by the social media companies if you're not careful with this. But interesting that myself self-management is actually quite high. I wonder, and this audience is quite an educated audience with regards to the technology and what's happening. So is that a good sign? If this poll rolled out to citizens, the man in the street, would we get the same response?
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And I mean, as you mentioned, John, you want somebody to call when there's a problem. And if you're in charge of it yourself, you need to call yourself if you have a problem. So I think from that perspective, I mean, I wouldn't want to have responsibility, liability, etc. with this myself. I would want, you know, if something screws up, I want somebody to be responsible. So, but interesting that actually the highest number was doing it yourself. So
yeah,
maybe we're wrong.
It's the real use of trust, probably one of the more fundamental uses of the word trust, because you want to trust somebody in the sense that if something goes wrong, I want them to be on my side.
Yeah,
something as fundamental as my identity. That's what I would want.
Right. It was interesting to see that, you know, the number, nobody wants the big techs to do that, and still they are really some of the drivers. I mean, Apple ID is coming now. I mean, you have a lot of places log in with Google and Facebook. Any comments on that, Sam?
So it's understandable why, because in our view, like the next big company is going to be an identity company. In our view, that company is going to be a pure identity company. But the big techs are coming because they understand that at the root of all transactions is all underpinned by identity. And they've been looking to get into finance and payments and other finance for quite some time, and they've done that moderately successfully. But they can see that they're only able to scale globally once they lock down an identity infrastructure. The challenge that they're finding, on the one hand, Facebook, if there's one company in the world that can't run fast and break things right now with personal data, it's Facebook, because they're, as it's quite evident, you know, they're giving evidence on the Hill in the States, in DC, relatively frequently. Apple, on the other hand, has a really strong trust component in their proposition and amongst their customers. I'm more optimistic with that. The challenge is, if we go back to your previous answer, which was around, in my view, this has to be a company-led industry change. So companies ought to be the ones that drive a new version of a futuristic identity ecosystem. It's hard to see Apple driving that, because Apple also offers financial services. And they're increasingly finding that other financial service companies aren't happy with essentially partnering with Apple too much, because they get access to less information, and there's an asymmetry challenge here. And over time, Apple's going to grow and the others will not. And as a result, there's a partnership alignment problem. So it's going to be interesting to see where it comes to. But unlike Facebook, Apple at least has a bit more trust with consumers, which is going to be key to making this work.
Yeah, I think one of the best news for privacy that I saw the last couple of weeks was Facebook lashing out at the Apple's business model because they're tightening the privacy. And with iOS 14, I mean, you can monitor who's using your copy buffer, and that revealed some interesting results. So I think in that perspective, I mean, Apple has an important role. I mean, they don't have any incentive to use the private data. They want to sell thingies, phones and Macs and stuff like that. So it's interesting, that diversion between the big techs. But John, you think will some international organizations have any saying this? I mean, we have Europe with EIDAS, which is moving slowly, but I mean, how important will that be in establishing identity in a few years?
Regulations like EIDAS, I'm going to be shot for saying this. I think are bit players in this, because they facilitate the cross-border, etc., very nice, but they're facilitating the fundamental concept of identity, cross-border identity or whatever. More important is making sure that the identity is managed and satisfactory for the citizen. Why Facebook didn't do very well in that last poll, and the tech giants didn't do very well, I think it's almost with the exception of government, which has got other reasons, I think the rest of the poll choices almost matched the capability of communication, help communication. You try speaking to anybody at Google, at Facebook, what's going to happen if you've got a problem, a real complex problem? How do you actually manage that? And I think that's generally where it is. I know Apple's quite good. I know Microsoft has turned around tremendously. But people like Facebook, and actually, strangely enough, governments to an extent now, you just can't speak to people at all. And that breaks down the trust. And ultimately, that breaks down who you want to manage your identity. Governments, where the exception is, governments have another attribute which is useful, is that they can act as a trust anchor. They've got the ultimate trust for an individual. You know, I'm a citizen. I've got my passport and all the rest, and they're issuing out the original ID. There is not economics of scale, but there is. But it's also, there's an economics of trust there. And it's mutual interest. In fact, if you're not a citizen, you can't pay tax. So they've got to.
You won't get the benefits either, right? I started, looking into that, and it's really hard. If you wanted to become stateless by choice, it's actually extremely difficult, because you can, be a citizen of a different country, but trying to become stateless, if you for whatever reason want it, is actually close to impossible.
It depends. You can go to a lot of the war zones in really rural areas and deprived parts of the world. They're more or less stateless, because you don't have any of the other benefits of security and regulation and so on. And that's the challenge with the government, in that they ought to be the source of trust in where you go to. And I'm more traditional with like trust. I absolutely do not trust big tech companies in any way. Nor I don't think anyone should. It's pretty clear. Like, the objective is to use data where possible to maximize profits, and that's just really straightforward. And the challenge with government, especially the current one, is also a trust issue. So when you get back to getting to a world where we recognize the importance of identity and enabling the only plausible way for trust to be established, which is the individual themselves, but to make it super simple, super straightforward, so that they are, as John mentioned earlier, if there's a customer support question or anything else, they'd be able to have that resolved. But it's going to be really interesting in the next 5 or 10 years, because specifically of COVID-19, governments are now seeing the necessity and the value in having this working well, and trying to explore where private companies can come and do some sort of partnership where relevant, as you'd be well aware. and getting the right balance between a regulatory sort of framework, which is what the government can only do, what only the government can do, and what they are really best at, and the tech companies and private companies that can come and just focus on developing the best solutions that customers care about. Having the right balance between the two can fundamentally solve this problem. Because we were able to go to the moon 50 years ago. Why is it so hard for my device to know that it's me, or for me to prove that, you know, I want to sign the documents, I have to go and see someone and have it notarized, for instance? We as humans are really more than capable of solving this. It's just being able to put the right building blocks together so that it all works.
I completely agree. I mean, the tech companies are in the position to make things happen, but the government needs to sort of put the restrictions and the direction we want to go, and, you know, what the liabilities and what you can do with private data, which, you know, they are doing now with the GDPR and EIDAS and things like that are coming in. We have another poll just asking, you know, the audience, what are the most important evolution they see for the end users? You know, again, just a simple questionnaire to ask on that. And while we're waiting for that, John, what do you see? What will be most important for we, not as nerds, but as users?
As users, I would honestly think one thing that you've not got on here is increased trust, and because that is not the same as security or privacy. It's when it goes wrong, that's always the case. So from my point of view, I think the reduced friction would have been the answer I would put here, because you would expect security and privacy to build up, but only if there is trust in the authentication and the mechanisms around that. So and trust in the I mean in the sense of somebody helping me when it goes wrong. That's the thing. If I go to something which is easy to use, but there's a reduced authentication, as long as somebody cuts it, just like a credit card, that's where I go. And I think people will demand that.
Exactly. Let's show the results here now. And Hussein, maybe you want to comment on the results we're seeing?
And I completely agree with John. So if trust were here, it'd probably be trust and friction as the key ones. And then privacy and security as like they have to be a baseline, like a hygiene factor. And over time, they'd all sort of improve. Cross-border usage would be just like a bonus factor. And it is, yeah, reduced friction. As far as the four here, reduced friction definitely does seem to be the key, would be the key condition that have to be met in order for this to improve.
Yeah, so I mean, they were quite evenly spread. So I think all of these items are important. And I guess if there were multiple choice, I guess people would cross out everything here because we want better security. And I agree with John. I mean, trust is part of it. We want this. The trust is really essential for this to work at all. If you don't trust it, well, it's not going to work. So, I mean, we're talking about the future. If we look at 2030, that's 10 years in the future. It's difficult to predict. Will we see any new exciting use cases for this that we, I mean, what would that be? You're smiling and saying, what? Any thoughts?
Oh, I think there are going to be loads. So there is, historically, it's been account creation for financial services like a bank and so on. But then it became trust marketplaces. You know, you can have a babysitter or nanny tutor cleaner come into your home without any human having verified them historically, but the fact that a platform has verified them digitally is sufficient. You can now vote in more countries, right? We know the Estonian model well, and hopefully more and more countries are going to be like that. So the ones that I think we're going to see a significant growth in are actually digital access, but in a physical setting. So checking into a train station or checking into an airport. We're already seeing it with Clear in the US, Clear Me. It's just an app, and for domestic flights, you can check in. You go from curb to gate. At 5 points, you're checked. Bag drop, security, lounge, and gate, and so on, with only that app, and no need for any physical identity whatsoever. So it's actually the more physical offline world use cases, including accessing buildings. Again, given COVID-19, given that there's now a risk of touching pads and so on, and touching handles and doors, and having guests verified before they come to a building for a meeting. Maybe they've had a test that morning to show that they don't have the virus today, or maybe they want to travel from Australia to New Zealand and they want to prove that they've either had the virus and now recovered, or have just had a test and can confirm that they don't carry it that day. Increasingly, we're going to, I think, see identity implemented in actual offline physical world too.
I think that's important. I mean, and also in the perspective of proving that you have some capability. I mean, proving you are a doctor, so you can actually, assist somebody. So that physical meeting part, I think it's important to this. Any comment, John?
This is context again. This is
exactly.
Identity carrying context. Many years ago, there was in the States, context became very prevalent in after 9/11, and first responders had a fluid context for what they were allowed to do. So you could walk across a state line, and your permission and your certification as a doctor would vanish if you went over a state line from one state to another if you weren't a doctor. And it's the context. Your credentials were context driven, the context being the location in that particular time. And I think that credentials, what you're talking about with regards to building entry, is an identity contextualizing your attributes suitable for that building, for that meeting, say. So the building asks, say, and it gets back to the butler, have you got a credential that shows you are COVID positive for antibodies?
Exactly, yeah.
And
so, I agree. I mean, that it's all about context, improving then different things. So we're receiving some interesting questions from the audience. The first one here was that I mentioned something about that the signing person has to be physically present. And is this to conform to IRIS or local Scandinavian law? So this is something that will be introduced in Norway in 2021, recognizing that the use of bank ID only shows the identity of the owner of the bank ID, not it's actually that person that is sitting there using it. There have been some fraud cases where close relatives have either voluntarily or been able to guess credentials and be able to use that. So the new financial regulation in Norway increases the liability for finance institution, which is probably why they want to go into that. But here's an interesting question. I mean, Hussein, you're doing an excellent job in Onfido globally for recognizing identity paper. But what about the approach that the fact that not all government identity issuing is credible in the first place?
There is a question of identity fraud, and so the core focus of our company has been over the last 8 years assessing whether a driving license or a passport that is submitted is genuine or not. And because we've seen tens of millions and using machine learning and computer vision, we know what patterns to expect and what seems to be fraudulent. And we can detect fakes that the human eye can't typically. And therefore, we're kind of like an antivirus software. We don't catch every fake. But what we commit to is catching many more than manual approaches or alternative approaches. And more importantly, that we get better with time. Because as and when we miss sophisticated fakes, our clients would tell us a month later. And we can use those samples to build future versions to stop that. Hence, these feedback loops drive up the security bar and means it's only the most sophisticated process can cheat it, whereas the others can't. But in the very long term, it does depend on how good that country is in issuing government IDs that have good security features. So an old Italian passport from the 1990s really is kind of a paper-based document. There's a ceiling to how good we can assert, and we only ever go back with it. This seems secure, but this is a tier 2 document, so it comes with those caveats until we transition into a more, you could say, risk-aware government infrastructure for issuing identities that are actually have more patterns and more security features, which is increasingly happening in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere.
Right. I mean, so there will be different trust in identity papers from different countries, right?
It already exists, but the trend is really positive. more and more identities. There were like cases in the 80s and 90s, but Europe, the US, and a growing part of the Southeast Asia and elsewhere, the new versions are getting better. And you have to remember, every 5 or 10 years, you usually have to renew your driving license, often your passport, and so on.
Exactly. So, question related to that is, what if a government prohibits reading of the document by non-government agencies? I mean, are there any examples of that? This was a question from the audience again.
It's a very good question. I can't think of any examples of that. It's a significant sort of hindrance to the economy should that happen, because it's sort of, the economy can't function without people being able to prove that they are who they claim to be. And the standard is becoming using a government ID to essentially prove that you are who you claim to be. It's really hard to see if the government were to prohibit that. You can see it in an authoritative regime, like I could see where in China they'd say only the Chinese tool can be used, but it's state-run, so that's more for security and political reasons, as opposed to it having any material benefit as far as commerce or progress.
Yeah,
I think
that should, because of that power that they have, it's more of a reason why the digital identity ecosystem that is to come over the next 10 years should not be dependent on the government. The government's role is to issue you with a paper-based identity credential when you're born, and when you get a driving license, and when you need a passport, and then allow that person to leverage that to develop their own digital identity that they own and control.
Yeah. Let's say we're closing the end here. A question I think to John is, is a digital identity, in your opinion, necessarily a self-sovereign identity?
no, it's not necessarily a sovereign identity. There are lots of initiatives at the moment exploring how self-sovereign ID can be used across Europe and can be utilized for cross-border transfer of evidences, such as birth certificates, driving licenses, and whatever, replacing the go get your credential notarized and then sent by post type of thing. And there's some EU research projects at the moment looking at those issues. The jury definitely isn't out at the moment. We're back to the issue that very nice if everybody's willing to do it, and probably pretty secure as well, but not everybody's going to do it. It's going to be a small group that have either particular needs or they need to have a variety of evidences that they need to juggle around all the time. Sorry, evidences being like a driving license or something like that. Governments will, and you don't wish to actually, and you want to keep it out of the domain of governments when you're transferring this information, because governments will transfer the information electronically, but there are methods being looked at that will be self-sovereign, so that the citizen acts as a air gap between the organization that generates the evidence and the consumer, the originator and the consumer, and the person acts as an air gap. It's good for privacy and all the rest. Whether or not it's good to manage, maybe there's some other mechanism that might be done. But I also think that governments want to have citizens. Governments want citizens because citizens equals tax. And if you, anything that reduces the power of the government to generate tax, to obtain tax from its citizens, is not going to work. There's governments in particular have a quirky thing about ownership of their citizens, which has plagued identity systems across the world for years.
Exactly.
It's some sort of avarice, I think, for identity. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very good, John. I think we time for one more question. It says, how will deep fake tech affect identity verification, Hussein?
So it is inevitable that it will. Fraudsters are becoming more sophisticated all the time. The most sophisticated ones do it as a career. We see a drop off in fraud over the weekend. That's not because volumes go down. In fact, volumes go up, but that's because the sophisticated fraudsters need to also break. They also get holiday pay, they get performance related pay, they work in office environments, and I'm quite confident they are mostly adhering to social distancing and other rules as well. The point becomes that as they become more sophisticated, us, Signicat, we all equally have to up our game. And in essence, the specific use of deepfakes, we've not yet seen it. We have a liveness check that requires a face to sort of go through read three randomly generated numbers and perform a randomized task. So it may have been cheated, we don't know of it yet if it has happened. The question becomes, in order for you to use a deepfake with the mask and everything to be able to cheat it, it takes about half a day and takes $10,000 of equipment to get there. It's theoretically very possible, and that cost is going to come down. It's going to become easier with time, but it hasn't yet happened because fraudsters, when you consider the professional ones, they want to attack 100 times a day, not twice a day. They're looking for the scalable ways of committing fraud. So it's more of a theoretical point as a practical one for now. Over time, it's going to become more serious, and the pressure is on us to up our game in parallel. Not just in parallel, ideally to get ahead of it.
Right. I mean, it's similar to why the magnetic stripe cards survived so long, because I mean the attacks weren't that serious, and now of course they're all with the chip on the cards. So yeah, constantly the battle to stay one step ahead of the fraudsters, at least try to meet and make sure we don't get too many fraudulent identities.
You want continually make the bad guys pay more and more and more to break the system, because many people forget that it's an economic mechanism. 9 times out of 10, okay, forget the government warfare sort of thing, but generally it's you make it uneconomic to break it, they'll go and look for something else to break.
Do something else, exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So let's do the final question, because I think that's very good. I mean, that's a direct question to each of us, as at least I'm a self-proclaimed identity nerd, and I'll put you guys in the same boat there. And they ask, what do EMA, Onfido, and Signicat see as the role of driving this agenda forward? So let's start with John. What's your role in driving this forward?
Well, we want to try and get our members and influencers within the EU and globally, in fact, to understand that we have to still strive to find a solution that will work and reduce it down. Identity must be, although we don't joke, but we say, well, it's a commodity. It's something so fundamental that we have to ensure that it's going to be progress forward and not go backwards because of security or whatever. We've got to drive it forward, and citizens are going now, definitely after COVID, are going to demand more and more identity, I guess, consolidation. I would love to be able to not care about the platform that I'm on, have one identification for any web platform that I'm working on, and I can just say, oh, we'll get together and meet, just as easy as to meet in the street, meet with confidence online or whatever it is, and then pass credentials or whatever it is, absolutely with confidence. That needs strong identity.
Sounds very good. Yeah,
I think the issue is, sorry, just one thing is, I think the issue is that we do need to have biometrics in there with regards to something like a facial biometric, so I can recognize. It's still the mechanism that most people use and fall back to, and that's important because you're not always online. That's the real world.
Excellent.
In essence,
Hussein, go ahead.
Working with partners such as yourselves and not expecting government or big tech or anyone to make a change. So rolling our sleeves up with partners and just making the market ourselves.
Yeah.
No, and I subscribe to that. We work with partners like Onfido. We work with EMA. We help driving this agenda forward. Try making identity available, accessible, simple for users, for service providers, for everybody. So I think that's an important part of this, making it available. Okay, we run out of time. This was a really fun discussion. It's always fun to look into the crystal ball and see what's coming. And it would probably be interesting to in 10 years' time go back and watch this webinar to see what we said and what the world really looks like. Thank you so much, John and Hussein, for joining this. It was really good discussion. Thanks to the audience for joining and for participating in the polls. We got some interesting feedback from you. When this closes down, there's going to be a quick survey, and if you could spend just a minute filling that would be extremely appreciated. So then I think we'll just say thank you to everybody and hope to see you at our next webinar. Follow our the web pages and you'll see we have some more exciting stuff coming up.
Thanks, it's been fun.
Likewise, thank you all.